Millionaire disguised himself as a poor man and moved into an elderly woman's garage. One day he entered the house without knocking and was shocked by what she was doing. Alejandro Rivers gazed out over the city from the penthouse of his luxurious skyscraper. At 30 years old, he was the owner of a financial empire he had inherited after the tragic death of his parents a decade ago. The afternoon sun bathed the glass and steel skyscrapers in a golden glow, but not even that sight could bring a smile to his face. With a sigh, he turned away from the window and poured himself a whiskey. The amber liquid gleamed in the cut crystal glass, but Alejandro barely noticed. He was too lost in his thoughts, in that emptiness gnawing at him from within. Mr. Rivers, his personal assistant's voice broke through his reverie. "The board is waiting for you in the conference room." Alejandro nodded without enthusiasm. Another meeting, another business decision that meant nothing to him. What was the point of having all the money in the world if he had no one to share it with? As he walked down the marble halls of Rivers Enterprises, Alejandro remembered his parents, Robert and Eleanor Rivers, had been towering figures in the business world, but to him, they were simply mom and dad. Their death in a plane crash when he was 20 had left him devastated, with a fortune he didn't know how to manage. The meeting went as so many others had. Numbers, charts, growth projections. Alejandro nodded and gave his approval mechanically, his mind wandering far from there. When it finally ended, he bade the executives farewell and went for a walk through the city streets. It was a cool spring night. The neon lights of the shops illuminated the sidewalks filled with people coming and going, each immersed in their own world. Alejandro walked among them, feeling more alone than ever. Then he saw her, an elderly woman sitting on the sidewalk, sharing a piece of bread with a young woman who seemed to be her daughter. The scene moved him deeply. Despite having nothing, those two women seemed to have everything he lacked: love, companionship, a purpose. Alejandro stopped in front of them, hesitating for a moment before pulling out his wallet. The elderly woman looked up, her eyes tired but kind. "Good evening, young man," she said with a warm smile. "Do you have any extra bread?" That question disarmed him completely. Here he was, with more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, and this woman was asking him for a piece of bread. Without a second thought, Alejandro took out all the cash he had and offered it to them. "Please take it," he said, his voice trembling. "You need it more than I do." The elderly woman looked at him in surprise, but before she could say anything, Alejandro quickly walked away, losing himself in the crowd. His heart pounded, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. A spark of emotion, of purpose. That night, as he lay in his king-size bed in his lonely penthouse, Alejandro couldn't stop thinking about the elderly woman and her daughter. What would they do with the money he had given them? Would it change their lives? And then an idea began to form in his mind. An idea that would change not only the lives of those two women, but also his own. With renewed energy, Alejandro got up and turned on his computer. He spent hours researching, planning, preparing what would be the most important experiment of his life. By the time the sun began to rise over the horizon, he had everything ready. He would make an anonymous $1 million donation to the elderly woman. Then he would disguise himself as a homeless man to see up close how that action would transform their lives. It was risky, perhaps even a little crazy. But for the first time in years, Alejandro felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. As the new day dawned over the city, Alejandro Rivers smiled. He didn't know what the future held, but he was sure of one thing: his life was about to change forever. Louise Garrison, 65, woke up like every morning in the small room she shared with her daughter Lucy at a shelter for the homeless. Despite the hardships, Louise always kept a smile on her face, marked by time and suffering. "Good morning, my girl," she greeted Lucy, who was already up and getting dressed for her job as a cashier at a grocery store. "Good morning, Mom," Lucy replied with a tired smile. "How are you feeling today?" "Ready to conquer the world," Louise joked, though both knew that reality was far different. As Lucy prepared to leave, Louise remembered the encounter the night before with the elegant young man who had given them a generous amount of money. Thanks to him, today they could afford a decent breakfast at the corner cafe. "Come on, Mum," Lucy said, taking her mother's arm. "I'll treat you to breakfast before I go to work." At the cafe, as they enjoyed scrambled eggs and hot coffee, the waitress approached their table with an envelope in hand. "Excuse me, are you Louise and Lucy Garrison?" she asked. Both women nodded, surprised. "This envelope came for you this morning," the waitress said, handing it to Louise. With trembling hands, Louise opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a check that made her eyes widen. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed, clutching her chest. "Lucy, look at this." Lucy took the check and nearly fainted at the amount, $1 million. The attached letter read, "Dear Louise and Lucy Garrison, your kindness and generosity have not gone unnoticed. This gift is to help you live the life you deserve. Use it wisely, and always remember to help others as you have done so far. A friend." Tears streamed down both women's cheeks as they tried to process what was happening. Who could have done such a thing? Was it real or some kind of cruel joke? "We need to go to the bank," Lucy said, regaining her composure. "We need to know if this is real." After a visit to the bank confirmed the authenticity of the check, Louise and Lucy suddenly found themselves with a wealth they had never dreamed of. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. The first thing they did was look for a house. They found a beautiful property in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden where Louise could grow the flowers she loved so much. The move was quick. After all, they had few possessions. One night, as they dined in their new dining room, Lucy looked at her mother with concern. "Mom, are you sure we should keep all this money?" she asked. "It's too much." Louise gently took her daughter's hand and squeezed it. "My dear, this money is a gift, a blessing. But you're right, it's more than we need. What do you think if we use some for ourselves and the rest to help others who are going through what we went through?" Lucy smiled, relieved. "That sounds perfect, Mom." Meanwhile, in his luxurious penthouse, Alejandro Rivers prepared for the next phase of his plan. He looked in the mirror, barely recognizing himself with the scruffy beard he had grown and the old, worn clothes he had bought at a thrift store. "It's time," he told himself, taking a deep breath that night. A disheveled, seemingly homeless man knocked on the door of Louise and Lucy's new house. When Louise opened it, she found herself looking into eyes that, though tired, shone with a familiar intensity. "Good evening, ma'am," the man said in a rough voice. "My name is Michael. I've been walking all day and have nowhere to stay. Would you be kind enough to let me sleep on your porch?" Louise looked at the man, remembering the countless nights she and Lucy had spent on the streets. Without a second's hesitation, she replied, "Of course not, young man. You won't sleep on the porch. We have a garage with a small room. You can stay there as long as you need." Alejandro, playing the role of Michael, felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected such immediate and sincere generosity. "Thank you, ma'am. I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "There's nothing to thank," Louise replied with a warm smile. "We all need help at some point. Come, I'll show you where you can stay." As he followed Louise to the garage, Alejandro realized that this experiment was going to be much more profound and transformative than he had imagined. And so, unknowingly, the three protagonists of this story took the first steps on a path that would change their lives forever. Days turned into weeks, and Michael became a part of Louise and Lucy's daily life. Alejandro, still maintaining his disguise, was increasingly amazed by the kindness and strength of these two women. One morning, while helping Louise in the garden, he noticed her looking wistfully at an empty corner of the yard. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Garrison?" he asked, genuinely concerned. The woman sighed, a melancholic smile appearing on her wrinkled face. "Oh, it's nothing, Michael. I was just remembering. Many years ago, I used to have a little art studio out here. I painted pictures, you know. I wasn't famous or anything, but it made me happy." Alejandro felt his heart skip a beat. "Why did you stop painting?" Louise was silent for a moment, her gaze lost in the horizon. "Life, I suppose, hardships, worries. Little by little, I put the brushes aside, and then Well, we didn't even have a roof over our heads. At that moment, Alejandro made a decision. Mrs. Garrison, why don't you take up your art again? You have this beautiful house now. You could make a studio right here. Louise's eyes lit up for a moment, but then doubt clouded her gaze. Oh, I don't know, Michael. It's been so long I'm not even sure I remember how to hold a brush. It's never too late to start. Again, Alejandro insisted, feeling that perhaps he had found a way to help beyond money. How about we go buy some supplies? I'll help you set up the studio. Louise looked at him with a mix of surprise and gratitude. You're a good young man, Michael, all right. Let's do it. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Alejandro, always in his role as Michael, helped Louise buy canvases, brushes, and paints. Together, they cleaned and prepared a space in the garden to turn it into a small but cozy studio. The first time Louise picked up a brush after so many years, her hand trembled. But as the color began to flow onto the canvas, something awakened in her. A spark she thought had been extinguished, reignited. Alejandro watched in awe as the elderly woman came to life in front of the easel. Her eyes shone with a light he had never seen before, and a genuine smile illuminated her face as she worked one afternoon. While Louise was painting and Alejandro watched her in silence, Lucy came home from work. "Mom!" she exclaimed, surprised at the scene. "You're painting?" Louise turned to her daughter, with paint stains on her cheeks and a radiant smile. "Yes, my girl Michael convinced me to take up my old passion again." Lucy looked at Michael with gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured, tears in her eyes. "It's been years since I've seen my mother so happy." Alejandro felt a warmth in his chest that he couldn't explain. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. As the days passed, Alejandro found himself more and more immersed in the lives of Louise and Lucy. He helped with household chores, listened to Louise's stories about her years as an artist, and gradually learned the details of their lives. One night, while they were having dinner together, Louise began to talk about her past. "You know, we weren't always poor," she said with a tinge of sadness in her voice. "There was a time when we lived quite well thanks to my art." Alejandro and Lucy looked at her with interest, encouraging her to continue. "I was a promising artist," Louise continued. "My paintings sold well, and we had a comfortable life. But then," her voice broke a little, "I met a man. His name was Richard." Lucy took her mother's hand, offering silent support. Alejandro listened attentively, sensing that they were about to reveal something important. "Richard was charming at first," Louise went on. "He talked to me about great projects, about how we could make a fortune together with my talent. But little by little, things changed." Louise paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "It turned out that Richard was an art forger. He wanted me to paint copies of famous works so he could sell them as originals. I refused, of course, but he didn't take it well." Alejandro felt his blood run cold. "What did he do?" he asked, his voice tense. "He threatened me," Louise replied in a whisper. "He said that if I didn't cooperate, he would hurt Lucy, who was just a little girl. Then I was scared, and I gave in." Lucy hugged her mother, silent tears running down her cheeks. Alejandro felt a mix of anger and compassion. "For years I painted those forgeries," Louise continued. "I felt dirty, guilty. I lost the love for art, and when I finally gathered the courage to leave him, Richard made sure that no one in the art world would ever trust me again. We lost everything and ended up on the streets." A heavy silence fell over the table. Alejandro processed the information, feeling that something didn't add up. The name Richard, the art forgery, there was something familiar about this story. "Mrs. Garrison," he said finally, "do you have a photo of that man, of Richard?" Louise nodded slowly. "I think I still have one from the old days." "Why?" "Just curiosity," Alejandro lied, his heart pounding. Louise got up and went to get an old photo album. When she returned and showed Alejandro the picture, he felt the world collapse around him. The man in the photo, Richard, was his father, Robert Rivers. Alejandro felt like he couldn't breathe. Everything made sense now. His father's sudden fortune, the artworks that decorated his mansion, the mystery that had always surrounded the origin of his wealth. "Michael, are you all right?" Lucy asked, noticing his pale face. Alejandro nodded mechanically, unable to speak. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. How could it be that his father, the man who had raised him, was capable of something like this? And what should he do now with this information? That night, as he lay in the small bed in the garage, Alejandro made a decision. It was time to reveal the truth, to face the past and try to right his father's wrongs. But first he needed to know more, to fully understand Louise's story and how her life had intertwined with his family's. With a heavy but determined heart, Alejandro promised himself that he would do the right thing no matter the personal cost. The truth would come to light, and with it, perhaps the possibility of redemption and a new beginning for everyone. The following days were a torment for Alejandro. Every moment he spent with Louise and Lucy was tinged with guilt and anxiety. He wanted to confess, to reveal his true identity and the connection to his past, but he feared losing the trust and affection they had developed one afternoon. While helping Louise in her art studio, he couldn't contain his emotions any longer. "Mrs. Garrison," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." The elderly woman looked at him with tenderness, putting down her brushes. "What is it, Michael? You know you can trust me." Alejandro took a deep breath. "I am not who you think I am." Louise looked confused. "What do you mean?" "My name isn't Michael," Alejandro confessed. "I'm Alejandro Rivers, the son of Richard the man who hurt you so much." The silence that followed was deafening. Louise looked at him with a mix of shock and disbelief. "You're Richard's son?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alejandro nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I am, and I came here because I wanted to know the truth about my father and the origin of our fortune." Louise sank into a nearby chair, visibly affected. "All this time you've been pretending." "Not everything was pretend," Alejandro hurried to say. "My feelings, my desire to help, all of that is real. I just wanted to understand, and in doing so, I realized how wonderful you and Lucy are." At that moment, Lucy entered the studio, sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on?" she asked, looking from her mother to Alejandro. Louise, with a tired voice, replied, "Lucy, sit down. There's something we need to tell you." For the next hour, Alejandro recounted the entire story, who he really was, why he had come into their lives, and what he had discovered about his father. Lucy listened in silence, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, surprise, pain, and something Alejandro couldn't decipher. When he finished, silence fell over them again. Finally, it was Louise who spoke. "Alejandro," she said, using his real name for the first time, "I can't deny that I feel hurt by the deception, but I also see the young man who has helped us these weeks, who encouraged me to paint again, who has treated us with such kindness. That young man is real, isn't he?" Alejandro nodded, tears in his eyes. "He's the most real part of me that I've known in years." Lucy, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "What do you plan to do now?" Alejandro straightened up, his face showing a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. "I want to do the right thing. All the money I inherited from my father, it comes from the works you painted, Mrs. Garrison, and from other artists he swindled. It doesn't belong to me." "What are you saying?" Lucy asked, her eyes wide. "I'm going to donate all the fortune," Alejandro declared. "Most of it will go to charities that help struggling artists and the homeless, and of course a substantial portion will go to you to somehow compensate for all the harm my father caused." Louise shook her head. "We can't accept that money, Alejandro. Please," he insisted, "don't do it for me, do it for all the people you could help. You know better than anyone what it's like to be in need. Think of how many lives you could change." Lucy looked at her mother, then at Alejandro. "And what about you? What will you do after you've donated everything?" Alejandro smiled weakly. "Start over. Without the burden of that ill-gotten fortune, without my father's shadow over me." Maybe I can find a real purpose in my life." Louise slowly stood up and approached Alejandro. To his surprise, she hugged him. "You've made mistakes, like everyone else," she said softly. "But you're trying to do the right thing, that's what matters." Alejandro allowed himself to be enveloped in the embrace, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. When they parted, he saw that Lucy had also approached. "If you're going to start over," Lucy said with a small smile, "maybe you could stay here a little longer, to help us manage all those donations and charities." Alejandro looked at the two women, feeling that for the first time in his life, he had found a true home. "I'd love to," he replied, his heart full of hope. And so in that small studio filled with canvases and colors, 3 lives that fate had intertwined in the most unexpected way began to sketch together the outline of a new future, one full of possibilities, forgiveness, and redemption. The days following Alejandro's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. The news that the heir to the river's fortune would be donating all his wealth spread like wildfire through the financial and social circles of the city. Some called him crazy, others a saint, but Alejandro didn't care about others' opinions. He knew he was doing the right thing. Louise and Lucy, though initially reluctant, eventually agreed to help Alejandro manage the donations. Together, they created the New Dawn Foundation, dedicated to supporting struggling artists and the homeless. One morning, while having breakfast in the kitchen of what was now their shared home, Alejandro presented an idea that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking," he began, stirring his coffee distractedly. "What do you think about using some of the funds to create a community art center?" Louise looked at him with interest. "An art center?" Alejandro nodded, getting excited as he developed the idea. "Yes, a place where artists like you, Mrs. Garrison, can teach others, where people who have been through hardships can find an outlet through art. We could offer free classes, exhibitions. And it could also be a shelter," Lucy added, catching the enthusiasm. "A safe place for the homeless where they can stay while they recover and learn new skills." Louise smiled, her eyes shining with excitement. "It's a wonderful idea. We could change so many lives." And so, with renewed energy, the 3 embarked on this new project. They found an old abandoned building in the city center and transformed it. Alejandro used his business contacts to expedite permits and garner additional support. Lucy took charge of logistics and administration, proving to have a natural talent for management. And Louise, with her experience and compassionate heart, became the soul of the center. The day of the New Dawn Art Center and shelter's grand opening was a moment of celebration and emotion. Dozens of people gathered, local artists, former shelter companions of Louise and Lucy, curious neighbors, and even some of Alejandro's former business associates who had decided to support the cause. As they cut the ribbon to inaugurate the center, Alejandro looked at Louise and Lucy, feeling a surge of gratitude and affection. These 2 women, who had come into his life in the most unexpected way, had become the family he had always longed for. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," he told them during a quiet moment. Away from the bustle of the celebration, Louise took his hand. "There's nothing to thank, son. We've all healed together in this process." Lucy nodded, adding with a smile, "Besides, someone has to keep you grounded. Don't think that just because you're a philanthropist now, you'll get out of doing the dishes at home." The 3 of them laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed in the air, symbolizing the new beginning they had forged together. As the months passed, the New Dawn Art Center flourished. It became a beacon of hope for many. In the city, Louise led painting workshops that not only taught artistic techniques, but also helped heal emotional wounds. Lucy organized job training, programs, and counseling to help people reintegrate into society. Alejandro, for his part, discovered an unexpected talent for teaching. He began giving basic administration and entrepreneurship classes, helping the center's residents develop skills that would allow them to become self-sufficient. One afternoon, while watching Louise guide a group of children in a painting activity, Alejandro felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Lucy. "You know," she said with a warm smile, "I think you've finally found your purpose." Alejandro nodded, feeling a peace he had never experienced before. "Yes, I think you're right. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something that really matters." Lucy looked at him with a mix of admiration and something more, a feeling that had been growing between them over the past months. "You've changed many lives, Alejandro, including ours." He looked at her, feeling a flutter in his stomach. "You changed mine first. You taught me what's really important in life." They were about to say more when Louise called them over. "Come on, I need your help with these little artists." Laughing, Alejandro and Lucy joined the group of children, their hands brushing lightly as they walked together. Days at the New Dawn Center were filled with challenges, but also with joys. Every success story, every recovered smile, every piece of art created, was a reminder of the power of compassion and second chances. One night, while they were having dinner at home, Louise surprised Alejandro and Lucy with some news. "I've decided to organize an exhibition," she announced with a mix of nervousness and excitement. "An exhibition of my new works." Alejandro and Lucy exchanged looks of surprise and joy. "That's wonderful, Mom," Lucy exclaimed, hugging her mother. "I'm so proud of you, Mrs. Garrison," Alejandro added, feeling a warmth in his chest at seeing the happiness on the face of the woman who had become like a mother to him. Louise smiled, her eyes shining with a light they hadn't had in years. "Thanks to both of you, you gave me the strength to believe in myself and my art again." Preparations for the exhibition became a family project. Alejandro used his contacts. To secure a prestigious gallery, Lucy handled logistics and publicity, and Louise worked tirelessly on her new creations. The night of the opening arrived. The gallery was filled with people, local artists, art critics, residents of the New Dawn Center, and, to everyone's surprise, even some important collectors. Louise, elegant in a dress that Lucy had insisted on buying for her, was radiant as she guided guests through her collection. Her new works were an explosion of color and emotion, reflecting her journey from despair to hope and renewal. At one point, Alejandro found himself in front of a particular painting that took his breath away. It was a portrait of three figures, an older woman, a young woman, and a man there, silhouettes intertwined in an embrace, surrounded by warm, vibrant colors. "That's us," he whispered, recognizing the representation of their little family. "Yes," Louise's voice came from behind him. "My family, our family." Alejandro turned, tears in his eyes, and hugged the woman who had taught him the true meaning of love and compassion. The exhibition was an overwhelming success. Critics praised the emotional depth and technique of Louise's work, and several paintings sold that very night. But for Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise, the real triumph was seeing how their love and mutual support had blossomed into something beautiful and meaningful. As the night drew to a close and the last guests left, the three of them remained alone in the gallery, surrounded by the works that told their story. "You know," Louise said with a serene smile, "I think I've finally found my happy ending, and it's much better than I ever imagined." Alejandro and Lucy hugged her, forming a living echo of the portrait that hung on the wall. "It's not an ending, Mum," Lucy said softly. "It's a new beginning for all of us." And as they stood there, united in that embrace, Alejandro knew he had found something more valuable than any fortune. He had found a home, a family, and a purpose. And with that, he finally felt truly rich. As the New Dawn Center grew in popularity and Louise's art career flourished, life seemed to have found a perfect balance for Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise. However, the past has a peculiar way of resurfacing when least expected. One autumn morning, while Alejandro was sorting through the mail in the kitchen, an envelope caught his attention. It had no return address, just his name, written in elegant handwriting that vaguely seemed familiar. With a sense of unease, he opened it. Inside was a letter and an old photograph. The photo showed his father, Robert Rivers, standing alongside a group of men with grim expressions. Alejandro recognized one of them as Richard, the man who had abused Louise. The letter read, "Dear Alejandro, there are truths about your father that you still don't know. The empire he built has darker roots than you can imagine. If you want to know the truth, meet me at the old warehouse by the harbor this Saturday at midnight. Come alone, an old family friend." Alejandro felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Just when he thought he had left his father's murky legacy behind, the past returned to haunt him. "Alejandro, are you all right?" Lucy's voice broke through his thoughts. She was watching him with concern from the kitchen door. For a moment, Alejandro considered telling her everything, but the fear of involving her in something potentially dangerous stopped him. "Yes, just news from the bank about some old accounts," he lied, hating himself for it. Lucy nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. "All right, remember we're in this together, okay? You can tell me anything." Alejandro nodded, feeling guilty. "I know, thank you, Lucy." The following days were torture for Alejandro. He wavered between attending the mysterious meeting or ignoring it altogether. On one hand, he feared that any information about his father's past could endanger everything they had built. On the other, he felt he needed to know the full truth to finally close that chapter of his life. Saturday arrived too soon. Alejandro told Louise and Lucy that he had a late meeting with some potential donors for the center. He hated lying to them, but he convinced himself it was for their sake. At midnight, Alejandro found himself standing in front of the old warehouse by the harbor. The place was deserted, and a cold breeze blew in from the sea. With his heart pounding, he entered. The interior was dark and dusty. Suddenly, a voice emerged from the shadows. "You've grown up, Alejandro." An older man stepped out of the darkness. Alejandro recognized him from the photo. He was one of the men who had appeared alongside his father. "Who are you?" Alejandro asked, trying to keep calm. "My name is Gabriel. I was your father's partner for many years," the man replied with a sad smile. "And I've come to warn you." "Warn me about what?" Gabriel sighed. "Your father didn't just swindle artists like Louise Garrison. He got involved with some very dangerous people, Alejandro people, who are now very interested in you and what you're doing with your father's fortune." Alejandro felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "Your father laundered money for criminal organizations through the sale of forged art," Gabriel explained. "When he died, he left many debts unsettled, debts they now expect you to pay." Alejandro's mind was spinning. "But I've donated almost all the money. What's left is invested in the New Dawn Center." Gabriel nodded gravely. "I know, and they're not happy about it. They're planning to take action." "What kind of action?" Alejandro asked, though he feared the answer. "The kind that could put everyone around you in danger," Gabriel replied, "especially Louise and her daughter." Alejandro felt the world crumble around him. Everything he had built, the family he had found, was in danger because of his father's sins. "What can I do?" he asked, desperate. Gabriel handed him an envelope. "Here are proofs of all your father's illegal activities, and those of his associates. Give them to the authorities. It's the only way to stop them before they come after you and your loved ones." Alejandro took the envelope with trembling hands. "Why are you helping me?" Gabriel smiled sadly. "Because someone has to break this cycle of corruption and lies, and I believe you're the person, Alejandro." When Alejandro left the warehouse, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He knew he had a crucial decision to make, one that could change his life and that of his loved ones forever. As he drove back home, Alejandro realized that despite everything he had achieved, the ghost of his father still haunted him. Now more than ever, he would need the strength and love of his new family to face this threat and protect everything they had built together. With determination, Alejandro decided it was time to be completely honest with Louise and Lucy. He couldn't face this alone. Together, they would find a way to overcome this new challenge and ensure that the New Dawn Center's legacy would be one of hope and redemption, not fear and secrets. Alejandro arrived home past midnight, his heart heavy and his mind full of worries. To his surprise, he found Lucy waiting for him in the living room, her face etched with anxiety. "Alejandro, where have you been?" she asked, standing up from the couch. "I called every donor I know and no one had heard anything about a late-night meeting." Guilt struck Alejandro like a wave. He realized he could no longer keep the truth from them. "Lucy, I need to talk to you and Mrs. Garrison," he said gravely. "It's important." Minutes later, the three of them were seated in the kitchen. Louise, awake despite the late hour, looked at them with concern. Alejandro took a deep breath and began to tell them everything. The mysterious letter, his meeting with Gabrielle, and the terrible truth about his father's past. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Louise was the first to speak, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh, Alejandro, why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I wanted to protect you," he responded, his head bowed. "I thought I could handle this alone, but I was wrong. I can't face this without you." Lucy took his hand, her eyes full of determination. "You're not alone in this, Alejandro. We're a family, remember. We'll face this together." Louise nodded, a spark of her old fire in her eyes. "We've overcome worse things. We won't let the past destroy us now." Alejandro felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Together, they began to devise a plan. The next morning, Alejandro met with an old friend from law school who now worked at the district attorney's office. He handed over all the evidence Gabriel had given him, explaining the situation and requesting protection for his family and the New Dawn Center. The following days were tense. The authorities launched a thorough investigation, and soon, news of the corruption and money laundering network in the art world flooded the media. The New Dawn Center came under public scrutiny. Some questioned whether Alejandro had truly been unaware of his father's activities. Others speculated about the legitimacy of the donations and the origin of the money that funded the center. But amid the storm, Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise stood strong. They organized a press conference where Alejandro told the whole truth, how he had discovered his father's past, his decision to donate the fortune, and how the New Dawn Center had been born from a genuine desire to do good. Louise also spoke, sharing her story of abuse and overcoming adversity. Her bravery and honesty moved many, and soon a wave of support began to grow. Artists, business people, and ordinary citizens came together to defend the work of the New Dawn Center stories, of the lives that had been changed thanks to the center-flooded social media and the news. Meanwhile, the investigation progressed. Several of Robert Rivers' former associates were arrested, and little by little the criminal network began to crumble. One night, while Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise were having dinner together, as they had done so many times before, the phone rang. It was the district attorney in charge of the case. "It's over, Alejandro," he said, his voice tired but satisfied. "We've dismantled the entire organization. You're safe now." Alejandro felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. He shared the news with Lucy and Louise, and the three of them embraced, filled with relief and emotion. "We did it," Lucy whispered, tears in her eyes. Louise smiled, her face radiant with pride. "I always knew we would together." The days that followed brought a sense of renewal. The New Dawn Center, far from being harmed by the controversy, emerged stronger than ever. The transparency and honesty with which Alejandro had handled the situation inspired more people to support their cause. One afternoon, while Alejandro was walking through the halls of the center, observing the art classes and workshops in progress, he came across a scene that deeply moved him. Louise was sitting in front of an easel surrounded by a group of children. She was painting a beautiful landscape full of vibrant colors and hope. "Do you see this tree?" Louise explained to the children. "Even though its roots are in darkness, its branches reach for the light. That's how we are. No matter where we come from or how dark our past has been, we can always grow toward the light." Alejandro felt a lump form in his throat. Those words resonated deeply with him. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Lucy. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, watching the scene with affection. Alejandro nodded. "It is. We've all grown so much." Lucy looked at him, her eyes shining with a feeling that had been growing between them for months. "Alejandro, there's something I've been wanting to tell you." But before she could continue, they were interrupted by one of the center's volunteers. "Alejandro, Lucy, you have to see this," he exclaimed excitedly, gesturing toward the entrance. Outside, a crowd had gathered. They were neighborhood residents, local artists, and even some famous faces. They all held signs and banners in support of the New Dawn Center. "We want to thank you for everything you've done for our community," someone shouted from the crowd. Alejandro and Lucy stepped outside, surprised and moved. Louise joined them, her eyes shining with happiness. One by one, people began to share stories of how the center had changed their lives. Artists who had regained their passion, young people who had found a purpose, families who had overcome difficult times thanks to the support of the center. As they listened to the stories, Alejandro felt his heart fill with indescribable joy. He looked at Lucy and Louise, the two women who had changed his life, and knew he had found his true home. That night, after the impromptu celebration ended, Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise sat in their home garden under a sky full of stars. "You know," Alejandro said, looking up at the sky, "when I was a child, I always wondered what my purpose in life would be. I never imagined I would find it this way." Louise took his hand. "Sometimes, son, purpose finds us, and often it comes disguised as difficulties." Lucy nodded, resting her head on Alejandro's shoulder. "And sometimes our purpose is intertwined with that of others, like the three of us." Alejandro looked at Lucy, remembering the moment they had been interrupted at the center. "Lucy, what were you going to tell me earlier?" She smiled, a light blush coloring her cheeks. "I was going to tell you that I love you, Alejandro. That through all of this, I've fallen in love with you." Alejandro's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking twice, he kissed her gently. "I love you too, Lucy. I think I've loved you from the beginning." Louise watched them with a smile full of maternal love. "My children, you don't know how happy you make me." The three of them embraced under the starry sky, their hearts filled with love, gratitude, and hope for the future. In the months and years that followed, the New Dawn Center continued to grow and expand. Alejandro and Lucy married in a beautiful ceremony in the center's garden, surrounded by all the people whose lives they had touched. Louise, radiant with happiness, accompanied them to the altar. The story of Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise became an inspiration to many. They demonstrated that love, compassion, and determination could overcome any obstacle, and that even from the darkest beginnings a bright light could emerge. And so what began as an experiment born of loneliness and guilt transformed into a story of redemption, love, and purpose. Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise had found not only a family in each other, but also a legacy of hope that would endure long after their lives. 5 years had passed since that starry night in the garden. The New Dawn Center had become a beacon of hope not only for the city, but for the entire country. Delegations from other cities and countries regularly visited to learn from their model and replicate it in their communities. Alejandro and Lucy, now happily married, were expecting their first child. Louise, at 70, radiated a vitality and joy that was contagious to everyone around her. Her art had gained international recognition, and her works were exhibited in galleries around the world. One sunny spring morning, the three of them were in Alejandro's office at the center, discussing plans for the 5th anniversary celebration of the New Dawn Center. "I think we should do something really special," Lucy said, gently caressing her swollen belly. "Something that reflects all we've achieved and how far we've come." Louise nodded, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "How about a big art exhibition? We could showcase works from all the artists who have passed through the center over these 5 years. Alejandro smiled, taking his wife's hand. "That's a wonderful idea, and we could combine it with a charity gala to raise funds to expand the scholarship program." As they discussed the details, a knock on the door interrupted them. It was Carmen, one of the center's first residents and now one of the most beloved art teachers. "Sorry to interrupt," she said with a smile, "but there's someone here to see you." Behind Carmen appeared an older man with a distinguished appearance. Alejandro recognized him immediately. "Gabriel?" he asked, surprised. The man nodded, a shy smile on his face. "Hello, Alejandro. It's been a long time." Lucy and Louise looked at Alejandro curiously. He had told them about Gabriel, the man who had revealed the truth about his father years ago. Please, come." And Alejandro said, recovering from the surprise, "What brings you here?" Gabriel entered the office, his gaze sweeping over the walls covered in photographs and articles about the New Dawn Center. "I've been following your work, Alejandro," Gabriel said with admiration. "What you've achieved here is extraordinary." Alejandro introduced Gabriel to Lucy and Louise, briefly explaining his role in the events of 5 years ago. "I've come because—" Gabriel paused, as if searching for the right words. "Because I want to make peace with my past and I want to help, if you'll let me." Gabriel's revelation surprised everyone. It turned out that he had been more than just a partner of Robert Rivers. He had been his best friend, and for years he had turned a blind eye to the illegal activities, convincing himself that it wasn't his problem. "But seeing what you've done, Alejandro," Gabriel continued, "how you've transformed your father's legacy into something beautiful and meaningful made me realize that it's never too late to do the right thing." Gabriel explained that he had spent the last few years tracking down and recovering stolen or forged artworks from the time of Robert Rivers. He had managed to gather a considerable collection, and now he wanted to donate it to the New Dawn Center. "I want these works to be used for something good," Gabriel said. "To educate, to inspire, to heal." Alejandro, Lucy, and Louise looked at each other, moved by Gabriel's gesture. At that moment, Alejandro had an idea. "What do you think if we make this the central theme of our anniversary celebration?" He proposed. "We could set up a special exhibition with these works, telling the story of how art, once used for deception, is now used to heal and bring the community together." The idea was met with enthusiasm. In the following weeks, everyone worked tirelessly to prepare the exhibition and the gala. Artists, volunteers, and center residents came together to create something truly special. The day of the celebration arrived. The New Dawn Center was transformed. The walls were covered with artworks, each one telling a story of redemption and hope. In the center of the main hall, the recovered works donated by Gabriel were displayed, accompanied by panels explaining their history and new purpose. The gala was a resounding success. Art world, personalities, philanthropists, politicians, and ordinary citizens mingled, united by the inspiring story of the center. Louise, radiant in a dress she had designed and painted herself, was the center of attention, sharing stories and laughter with everyone who approached her. At one point in the evening, Alejandro took the stage to give a speech. He looked at the crowd, saw the smiling faces of Lucy and Louise, and felt a wave of emotion. "5 years ago," he began, "I was lost, trapped in a legacy I didn't understand and wanted to escape. But fate, or perhaps something greater than us, led me to meet 2 extraordinary women who changed my life forever." Alejandro paused, looking lovingly at Louise and Lucy. "Louise and Lucy taught me the true meaning of family, love, and purpose. They showed me that no matter where we come from or what mistakes our ancestors made, we always have the option to create something beautiful and meaningful with our lives." He continued speaking about the journey of the New Dawn Center, how it had grown from an idea born out of guilt and loneliness into a beacon of hope for so many. "But tonight isn't just about celebrating what we've achieved," Alejandro said. "It's about looking to the future, imagining what we can still do, because every day is a new dawn, a new opportunity to make the world a little better." Alejandro then revealed plans to expand the New Dawn Center, including opening new locations in other cities and launching an international scholarship program for young artists from disadvantaged communities. "And none of this would be possible without each one of you," he concluded, his voice full of emotion. "Every artist, every volunteer, every donor, every person who has walked through our doors seeking help or offering it, you are the heart of New Dawn. Thank you for believing in us, for believing in the power of art to heal and unite." When Alejandro stepped off the stage, he was met with a hug from Lucy and Louise. The 3 of them stayed like that for a moment, their hearts beating in unison, aware of how far they had come and how much they had grown together. The night continued with music, dancing, and lively conversations. Gabriel, who had remained in the background for most of the evening, approached Alejandro. "You've done something extraordinary here, Alejandro," Gabriel said, tears in his eyes. "Your father would be proud." Alejandro nodded, grateful. "Thank you, Gabriel. For everything, none of this would have been possible without you." As the celebration drew to a close, Alejandro, Lucy and Louise found themselves in the garden of their home, under the same starry sky that had witnessed so many important moments in their lives. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Lucy asked, her hand resting gently on her belly. Louise smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and nostalgia. "Life has a wonderful way of surprising us, doesn't it? When I think about where we were 5 years ago and where we are now," Alejandro hugged the two women who had changed his life. "We're very lucky," he said quietly, "and the best is yet to come." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to confirm his words, Lucy gasped softly. "Alejandro," she said, with a mix of surprise and excitement, "I think the baby's coming." The three of them looked at each other, a new wave of emotion washing over them. As they rushed to the hospital, Alejandro couldn't help but think of how perfect the moment was. On the night they celebrated 5 years of new beginnings, they were about to welcome a new life. Hours later, in the maternity ward, Alejandro held his newborn daughter in his arms. Lucy smiled, tired but radiant beside him, and Louise watched them all with infinite love. "What should we name her?" Lucy asked softly. Alejandro looked at his daughter, then at Lucy and Louise, and smiled. "How about Aurora?" he suggested, "because she's our new dawn." The two women nodded, tears of joy in their eyes. And so, in that hospital room, surrounded by love and hope, the family that had been born from improbable circumstances welcomed its newest member. Outside, the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. It was a new day, a new beginning. And for Alejandro, Lucy, Louise, and little Aurora, it was the promise of a bright future, full of love, art, and the joy of making the world a better place, one day at a time.